Sweet, as you know, is a professor of political theory at the University of Warwick, but he has worked a lot, and he has produced so many publications in the field of political philosophy. And particularly, he will share with us the last research that will appear in a book in August. In August, and from the starting, the book will be controversial, as far as we know. But I think the issue is really important. It's and the title. I don't know if also the title of the book is Family Values. It will be that one. And if you think family it has been the basic structure of the society until this century, and it has been the structure for several centuries, and it has been a common structure to all the different societies, most at least of the society. We got a name, and our name is the family name, and this is to say that it has been quite stable a structure until recently. And I was thinking just about this when I invited Adam to come here. And I was thinking that actually family is really something that is changing so fast, as it has never changed in the century before. We have different families. We are discussing if some couples can be considered as family. And all has happened in the last 20, 30 years. If you think of the Italian history, the law that passed the divorce was only in 1978, so 40 years ago. And now they are changing that law just as we are talking in the parliament, and passing a different law that make divorce much quicker. And as you know, in the European Union in several states, there is a discussion about recognizing different kind of families. So I can think from a political, sociological, historical point of view, a subject more important than this for the present times. So I'm really interested in listening what Adam will say to us. And please welcome Adam Swift.
So thank you very much, Stefano, and thank you for being here, especially those of you who do not do political philosophy, which I think is probably all of you. So thank you all for being here and listening to a political philosopher take a very philosophical perspective on the family. And in a way, the project was inspired partly by the kinds of social changes that Stefano was talking about. So in a time of great change about what constitutes a family, and especially competition in a way over terminology, or what counts as a family and what doesn't, the philosopher's response is to go back to very, very basic principles and ask, why do we have families at all? What reasons are there to have families, and what should families look like? If we understand the reasons to have families, then we can start to think about what form families should or must take. And that's really what the project is here. So this is the cover of the book, and all this work is co-written with a colleague at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Harry Brickhouse. And this is our cover, which perhaps makes it look as if we're endorsing a very traditional American white carnivorous family. But as you'll see, that's not quite how it is. So I'm going to just describe a little bit the shape of the book, because that gives you a sense of the shape of the project, and then I'll talk in more detail. So the idea is to kind of introduce the family in the context of two kinds of debates. One is a debate over the place of liberty in our society, and to what extent we need to respect the freedom of parents to raise their children as they wish, which some parents regard as a kind of a freedom that they are owed. And then there's a very interesting debate that sociologists are interested in about the conflict between the family and equality, because it's the way that families interact among themselves and transmit advantage between generations that creates inequalities of opportunity, and all societies face this kind of conflict between the family and equality of opportunity. And some political philosophers have argued that we should abolish the family on egalitarian grounds. So then we get to the question, okay, that's the problem, now let's talk about justifying the family, which may seem, given, as we heard, that the family is as universal an institution as there can be. The idea that you might need to justify it might seem strange, but for a philosopher the question is, well, why do we have families? What values, what good things in human lives are produced by families? And maybe children should be raised in other ways, as some philosophers have proposed. So the idea is to justify the family, first of all looking at the way it meets children's needs, and then secondly at the way, more interestingly perhaps, the way it meets adults' needs. And I'll talk a bit about that. And then what I'm really interested in is, okay, having justified the family and seen why families are the right way to raise children, what does that imply for the rights that parents should have over the children that they are raising? And again, we've divided into kind of two kinds of issues. What rights do parents have to confer advantage on their children, given the conflict with equality? And what rights do they have to shape or influence the values of their children, given that their children are separate people with their own lives to lead? And so I'll talk a little bit about that. So that's the general shape. So the kinds of questions I'm going to be talking about, the aim of our theory is to give us resources to address questions of this kind. Do parents have a moral right to send their children to elite private schools? Do they have a moral right to read their children bedtime stories? Do they have a moral right to raise their children in their preferred religion? And I will be talking about moral rights throughout. There's a complicated question about the proper relation between moral rights and legal rights. I'm not going to make any claims either about what the law is, because actually the law is different in different societies, and that's we philosophers think that's an empirical issue. But I'm not really going to say anything either about what the law should be, because that's also a separate question from the question about what moral rights people have, because sometimes there are good reasons not to legislate in ways that directly correspond to the moral rights that underlie the normative issue. Okay, and just very quickly, because I like it when people talk and I know kind of where they're coming from or how they came to do this stuff. So I kind of trained as a sociologist and as a political theorist simultaneously, and I did some work in the 90s on social mobility, but there's a lot of very, very technical work on social mobility, and everybody who does it is kind of in some way interested in equality of opportunity, but they don't really think very hard about what kind of equality of opportunity they're interested in. So I with colleagues, wrote a book trying to introduce a normative dimension to social mobility. And I then wrote a book which was about an issue that had kind of been deeply important to me all throughout my life, which was the moral issues underlying school choice. It was an issue in my family all along. What kind of school? Was it okay or not okay for a progressive egalitarian thinking family to send their children to? And so I wrote a book specifically about the ethics of school choice. And then I realized, having written that of course I really needed a general theory about what parents should be allowed to do for their children. Because I realized that I didn't think that they should be allowed to send their children to elite private schools. It seemed to me that that wasn't justified. But even I did think they should be allowed to read their children bedtime stories. So I needed a theory that would help me explain this distinction. And that's really what, 10 years later, I'm going to talk about now. So this is philosophy. So just to repeat, I operate with a really quite straightforward distinction between the fundamental values and principles that should underlie policy, and not just public policy, but also the choices that we make as individuals. There are kind of deep, in my view, pretty timeless, fundamental moral ideals at stake there. And then there's a completely separate question, which is, okay, so here we are now, what kind of policy should we have? Or indeed, here I am now, how should I act in the situation that I am in? So in political philosophy at the moment, there's a lot of debate around the distinction between ideal theory and non-ideal theory. I don't know if any of you have come across that. So John Rawls, who was the most influential political philosopher of the 20th century, deliberately wrote what he called ideal theory, which was, so what would an ideally just society look like? And then loads of critics came along and said, well, that's all very well, but it doesn't tell us what to do here and now, and anyway, it's completely unrealistic. And that both of those things may well be true, but it's a separate project to kind of try and identify the true principles that should regulate the society. So in my view, I have, as I say, this simple model whereby what we do, on the one hand, we do the philosophy of the kind that I'm going to be talking about today, and then we combine that in very difficult, complex ways with what social science tells us about how the world works. And philosophers are in no way expert on how the world works. I try and do a bit of both in my work, but I think of them as distinct enterprises. And then you combine them. You need to know what matters, what should we be trying to achieve, what rights do we need to respect that individuals have. We combine that with information about how the world works in order to generate prescriptions for how we should organise our societies, and also for how we should act as individuals, in my view. And I'm going to be doing the former of those things today. Okay, so I have this kind of conceptual framework whereby there are two different issues. There's the family in relation to questions of liberty, and there's the family in relation to questions of equality. So the first issue concerning liberty in the family is just very straightforwardly that parental rights, which many parents claim they have freedoms that must be respected, they must exercise freedom with respect to their children. You know, they say, I need to be free to raise my child as a Christian, or to raise my child as a Muslim, or to send my child. They regard this as an exercise of their freedom, which it is. But it's a very distinctive kind of freedom, because it's a freedom over another person. Right? It's not like the other, it's not like freedom of religion, or freedom of association, or freedom of occupation. Those are freedoms we have with respect to ourselves. The freedom that a parent claims is a freedom, the freedom a parent claims qua parent is a freedom to decide for somebody else what happens in their life. So there's a very distinctive challenge for liberal theory to think about parents' rights as freedoms. So there's a question about to what extent we must respect parents' freedom. So for example, the religious question, which I will raise a little bit. Okay. On the other hand, there's the conflict with the family. So we know, and increasingly, social science seems to be revealing that the major source of inequalities of opportunity between children are informal interactions within the family. So you might think that the reason why wealthy parents tend to have wealthy children and poor parents tend to have poor children, you might think that that's because the wealthy parents have lots of money and the poor parents don't have lots of money. But in fact, and of course that does play a major role, but increasingly it seems that it's these things nearer the bottom, social networks, values transmission, and the formation of ambition in children, and things like bedtime stories, informal interactions whereby cultural capital is transmitted from parents to children. These seem to be increasingly apparent as the main sources of inequality of opportunity between different children in the society. So the extent to which the family conflicts with equality of opportunity is becoming more apparent all the time. The better the research gets, the deeper we see the problem goes. Because, for example, the inequality between children who get bedtime stories and children who don't get bedtime stories, that's far, far bigger on average than the distinction between children who go to elite private schools and children who go to ordinary schools. Right? The influence of these kinds of informal interactions is much greater. So the question we're interested in then at the bottom is, well, what are the limits of legitimate parental partiality? To what extent may one legitimately favour one's own children, as opposed to everybody else's children, some of whom may be much worse off than one's own children? To what extent can we act on behalf of our own children as opposed to caring about everybody else? Okay, so the approach we take is to say, well, what makes parent-child relationships valuable in the first place? What is it that means that if we were organising society from scratch, deciding how children should be raised, why would we decide that we would have these things called parents, who would raise children in these things we call families, rather than having state institutions for child raising, which have been proposed? Plato famously proposed that at least the elite class should not be raised by parents, but should be raised in state institutions. We could decide that children would be best be raised in communes of various kinds, or in kind of collective enterprises without any particular attachments between particular adults and particular children. We could decide that. But on the whole, we think it's better, for the reasons I'll talk about now, that children be raised by parents. Better for children and better for adults. So the idea is that familial relationships, these distinctive kinds of relationships between parents and children, generate what we call familial relationship goods. That's just a name for the good things that these forms of relationship contribute to human well-being. So they're not goods in the economist sense, except that they're good. But they could be, the capacity to love. The capacity to love, that's a good thing. That makes your life go better if you have the capacity to love, rather than having been raised in a way that means you're not able to love. So for us, that is a relationship good. It's a good that comes from the relationship you have with your parent. So we say, okay, for children, the familial relationship goods that people get are, the idea is that there's enough evidence to show that intimate relationships with authoritative adults, with adults who have the authority to make decisions over the child, that very, very special kind of relationship, which is a close, intimate, loving relationship, but in which the adult has authority, at least to some extent. That kind of relationship is important for children's cognitive, moral, and emotional development. So we have a whole chapter, giving evidence for that claim. I'm just very quickly running through the outline of the theory. But the idea is that children need parents if they're going to develop into flourishing human beings. And we think about that by contrasting it with a commune or a kibbutz, or the idea of kind of full-time, and I mean literally full-time professional childcare, where it's a job. People's job is to look after children all the time. There are no parents, and there's no such thing as a parent. It's just somebody who's paid by the state to be a child raiser. And we all, I think we all think there would be something worse about a society that raised its children that way. It would be dysfunctional in some ways. And in fact, we go so far as to claim that children have a right to a parent. Right? So imagine you have, an orphaned child, or a child just washes up, you're on a desert island and a child washes up a new baby. You would feel that there was a duty on the adults, some way or other, to provide this child with parenting, if they possibly could. And what that means is, the way philosophers talk about it, if there's a duty to provide somebody with something, what that means is that they have a right to it. The right is a claim that corresponds to the duty that other people have. So we say, well, children have a right to a parent, and these goods are important enough to establish that claim. And then maybe more interestingly, adults also, you can see the punchline at the bottom there, adults have a right to be a parent, because the goods that these relationships contribute to the lives of adults are also very, very, very important. So we say that parenting a child makes a special and non-substitutable contribution to the well-being of adults. So if you think about the previous arguments, they were what we call child-centered. They were appealing simply to the interests of children. And if you just had that theory, then you would have no objection to allocating children to whoever would be the best parent for them. Right? What philosophers call the redistribution of children kind of paradox. So if only you care about children's interests, then no adult can object when a child is transferred to a better parent. But we think, well, no, we would be depriving the adult of something very important for the adult. That, I think, is pretty obvious, but it was a big development in the literature, which was previously entirely, almost entirely child-centered. So we say, look, there's something very special about getting to be a parent. And then we try and characterize what is special about being a parent, why that's so different from having a romantic relationship with a spouse or a lover, how different it is from having just however close a friend, an adult friend, and how different it is from having a pet. Right? And some people have challenged us on this. Some people say, no, it's just not that different from having a pet. But we think that raising a human being from infancy to adulthood is a very special kind of a job. It's a very morally responsible job, and it involves the exercise of capacities that are very, very valuable for the adult to exercise. So to have this, as we put it there, the discharge of the fiduciary role. So the fiduciary role is the role where you are acting on behalf of the child, like a lawyer can be a fiduciary for his client, or a doctor can be a fiduciary for her patient. So the parent is a fiduciary for the child, but the way that the parent discharges that role is through having a spontaneous, loving, intimate relationship. That is the way to be a good parent, because that's the way to give children what they need and what they have a right to. So we say, well, adults have an interest in getting to parent, and in fact the interest is so strong that they have a right to be a parent, if they want to, of course. And of course it's not the case that all adults it's not the case that all adults' lives go better simply by being a parent. Some people's lives go much, much worse for being a parent, and some people's lives go brilliantly without being parents at all. So it's not a universal claim, but it's a claim that enough human adults, relationships with children make enough of a contribution to enough adults that we should regard it as a right that people have if they want, to claim if they want. Okay, so the last line of that slide established, in our view, there is a right to parent. There is a right to be a parent. But in our view, our theory of familial relationship goods or family values also allows us to give a theory of what rights you have as a parent. So there are two quite separate questions. Do you have a right to be a parent? Yes or no? If you are a parent, what rights do you have over your child? And the idea is that this familial relationship goods theory helps us answer that question, the question we were looking at before. So just to kind of give a summary of the overall view, right? The overall view says, well look, familial relationships, the goods that we claim come from familial relationships, don't require these very extensive rights that we currently grant parents over their children. You don't need to be allowed to send your kid to an elite private school to get the goods that we talked about. You don't need to be able to raise your children in a particular religion. I'll talk in more detail about that, to get the goods that I talked about. So the idea is that this is a critical theory in the sense that it suggests that our current practice is much too concessive to parents. It grants them rights over their children that they don't actually need in order for the family to contribute its goods to the well-being of both children and adults. So we allow parents to do too much for their children in a way that disrupts equality more than is necessary. And we allow parents to regard their children as their property more than children are their property. I mean, in my view, children aren't their property at all. But the theory does generate certain kinds of proprietarian claims over children. But we shouldn't think of children as belonging to parents like property. And we shouldn't think of children as vehicles for parents to express themselves or to realize their adults' values. That's not what children are for, right? And the relationship is valuable for reasons that have nothing to do with treating one's children as means to the expression of one's own values or ends. That's the claim. So we now can see pretty clearly, since I'm talking in this very general way, why bedtime stories are legitimate, but elite private schools are not legitimate, right? Because bedtime stories and other activities like bedtime stories are exactly the kinds of interaction through which these familial relationships are realized. And they're the kinds of interaction that create the intimate relationship that produces the cognitive, moral, and physical development that children need. Right? Whereas elite private schools are not normally, sometimes they are, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but in the normal case, it's just not true that the parent needs to send their child to this fancy school in order to have the kind of relationship which is the reason why we have families, on our theory about the reason why we have families. Yeah? So a parent can't say, on our view, but look, I'm the child's parent, and as a parent, it's my right to go to send the child to this school rather than that school. Because they can't give an account of why the fact that they're the child's parent gives them a good reason to be allowed to do that. Whereas they can say that about bedtime stories. And the same applies to bequest of property. Right? So, again, it gets complicated when we get to the details, and maybe you'll want to talk about the details. But in general, there's our theory implies no right to bequeath property to your child. Because the bequeathing of property is not essential for the realization of the relationship that we say is why we have families in the first place. So just some clarifications on this kind of egalitarian aspect of the argument. So one is, suppose we do allow bedtime stories, as I think we should, there's still a very separate question about how we organise our society. Given that parents are reading children bedtime stories, there's a question about how we organise our society in terms of how much reward people get for having had bedtime stories read to them, compared to the children who don't get bedtime stories read to them. Right? So in practice, what happens is all the transmissions of cultural capital and personality formation and so on from parents to children, these are rewarded because we live in market societies which reward those characteristics in the children. And if you don't have the capacity to defer gratification, if you don't have cultural capital, then you will not do as well as the children who are getting that stuff from their parents. But how well you do, compared to these other children, is a function of how we choose to organise the society. So we could still have an egalitarian critique of the reward structure, even if we're allowing these transmissions of advantage through these informal interactions. Secondly, I'm sure there's some economists in the room, right, who will be thinking, yes, but if you don't allow parents to send their children to elite private schools, you remove incentives. And we need incentives to have an efficient, productive economy. Right? Now, there's an empirical issue about to what extent you need to allow parents to do things for their children for the sake of a functioning, efficient market economy. Yeah? But I'm willing to concede that there may be incentives arguments for allowing parents to send their children. My claim is that that is not anything they can claim a right to. Right? They can't say, but look, because I am this parent's child, I have the right to do this for her. They might be able to say, if you don't let me do this for her, then I won't act as efficiently, I won't allocate my labour and my other resources in an efficient way, and we'll all be worse off. They might be able to say that, but that wouldn't be a rights-based argument appealing to the value of the family. That would be an incentives-based argument appealing to what they would be willing to do under different institutional arrangements. Okay, so some more clarifications on this family and equality. So I'm not saying that one is never justified in sending one's child to an elite private school. I think there are circumstances in which a good parent will do that. Yeah? So if the local state school is really bad, if it's dangerous, if the child is suffering bullying or abuse there, then to protect the child, you may need to take her out of the inadequate school. And in fact, that book I mentioned, called How Not to Be a Hypocrite, that was all about the justifications that parents might have for taking their children away from state schools, even if they don't think state schools should exist. So for example, you might feel, well look, unless I send my child to this kind of special school, she will not have the same chances as other children. So imagine a child maybe of an ethnic minority who believes that there's discrimination in the labour market. Then, and in fact in the UK, the Asian minority, those who can afford it, are major users of the private system. And it's hard to criticise them if you believe that their children will otherwise face discrimination. So they're compensating. They're not getting their children advantage. They're compensating in advance for disadvantage that their children will suffer. And then finally, I do actually think that any parent who sends their child to as good a school as she can for the sake of because she loves the child, because she wants the child to be better off, I do actually think that they are acting to realise relationship goods, because I think that whenever you act in a loving way to benefit somebody you love, then you are realising this kind of good in your life. But I say I just don't think they're the really important ones. The really important ones are the ones that happen through things like bedtime stories. They're not the things that happen through things like bequeathing property or sending the child to a fancy school so that she can get a really good job later on. Okay, so moving on now to the kind of the issue of parents' rights to shape their children's values. Of course, some shaping of children's values is part of the job description. Right? Remember, I said parents have a duty to foster their child's emotional, physical, and moral development. So we want parents to raise their children to have certain kinds of values: tolerance, respect for others, the capacity to cooperate, the capacity to trust, the capacity to be trusted. These are all value considerations. And also, I think that there are forms of value shaping that will inevitably happen in a healthy parent-child relationship. Right? So if I am spontaneously parenting my children as I did, of course they find out what I think is good and what I think is bad. Right? Of course they find out that, you know, I like some TV programs and other TV programs I think are complete rubbish. Of course they find out that I have these beliefs about novels and these beliefs about poetry, and I like football but I don't think basketball is very interesting. Of course my values will in some way inform their lives in trivial ways but also in very deep ways. But that will be a byproduct of the kind of relationship that I was saying is the valuable relationship. Right? That's not me treating my child as a means to realise my values. Right? I'm not thinking, well, I'm a Jew and I have this child and I want my child to be a Jew, so I'm going to raise my child as a Jew. Right? That's a different thought completely from a thought about sharing one's life with one's children in a way that they have a close, informed relationship about who one is. So, I do in fact think that parents have a right to raise their children in their religion, you know, within limits, to some extent. So it's absolutely not. I have colleagues who think there is no right, but I have colleagues who think that one is obliged to keep secret. If one has religious beliefs, one has a duty to one's children to keep them secret, because otherwise you are distorting the way the child is emerging as an adult, right? You're over-influencing the child's development. And I don't agree with that. I think if you have to keep your deep beliefs secret from your child, then there's something wrong with the relationship. But that's different from treating your child as a means to the values that you hold, right? Because it's only because the relationship is valuable that I think these forms of transmission of values are permissible. And I think that there's a duty on all parents to facilitate their children's autonomy. Right? So it's important that children are able to choose for themselves how they live their lives when they get to the age where they're able to make that kind of a choice. And some forms of religious education and religious raising of children clearly violate, in my view, they clearly violate this duty to raise the child so that she can make her own judgments and act on those judgments. So some families in England, they have their children educated, they have their boys educated seriously, but they send their girls to schools where they are not being trained to be able to live their own lives if they decide to leave the Muslim faith. And that seems to be a violation of their parents' duty to raise the child to be an autonomous person. So, and this is we're at the end now, the last slide, and then just a little poem at the end. So the last slide, so there's a huge controversial area about the family which I haven't mentioned, but our view does have implications for, right? Which is about the relationship between biology, the biological basis of the family. Because when Stefano said the family is a universal institution, what he meant, likely, is that children being raised by those to whom they have some biological connection is a universal institution. But our theory of family values, nothing in anything I said made any mention of biology. I didn't make any claim about who was parenting. When I talked about parents, you probably thought I meant biological parents, or you had in your head the people who have produced the child, causally, right? That's what we normally mean when we talk about parents. But of course, adoptive parents are parents. If I adopt a child, I am the child's parent. And all the values and all the goods that I talked about are just as realizable in an adoptive family as they are in a biological family. So one implication of our theory of family values is that there's no deep connection to biology. So the reason why we should raise children in families, on our view, has no very deep connection to biological connection between the parents and the children. So, in our view, not only can family values be realised in single-sex families, nothing in my theory said anything about there being two parents, right? Nothing in my theory said, oh, by the way, those parents need to be a man and a woman. If you do have to, nothing in the theory said there needs to be a man and a woman, right? So the characterisation of the relationship deliberately made no mention of the gender or how many adults there were. So in our view, family relationship goods can be realised in all these kinds of families. In my view, there's no right to parent your genetic child. So if I happen to parent in the biological sense, if I happen to procreate and produce a genetic child, the mere fact that I have produced that child in the causal biological sense gives me no right to be that child's parent, right? I mean, there may be other reasons why I should be its parent, but the fact that I'm its genetic ancestor is no basis for a claim to control its life. Right? Remember, we're talking about the basis for the claim to control this other person's life. There may be, and there is some literature on this now in response to our theory, there may be a right to parent a child that one has gestated. Right? And that's different, right? Because you can carry a child without being genetically connected to it nowadays. And clearly men can father. No man I think yet has ever gestated a child. That will happen one day. But there are people who argue, but look, if I gestate the child, then I am already starting the kind of relationship you're talking about. And you think we have a right to that kind of relationship. So if I'm already forming in utero a relationship with my child, then I have a right to parent that child. And that may be true. But notice that would imply that the gestating mother has the right to parent the child, but the genetic father doesn't have the right to parent the child, which may be the right answer. But all of this may not be very important in real world terms, because it may well be that actually if we just look at the child's interests, we will conclude that in general, parenting by the genetic parent is the best way to organise parenting. Right? And that might be because of sociobiological reasons. We just have reason to think that people will be better parents to those to whom they have some genetic connection, or maybe those to whom they believe they have some genetic connection. Right? That's an interesting difference. You can imagine studies that look at the parenting of children who they believe are their genetic child, but actually they're not. And my guess is it's probably the belief that does the work, not the actual fact of the genetic connection. So it gets really kind of interesting. But my guess is that actually, on the whole, there are good reasons to have children raised by their biological parents. But they're nothing to do with the parent's right to raise the child, right? They're everything to do with the child's interest in being raised by the best parents. And the general policy of having that as the default looks like the right answer to me. Okay, and lastly, I'm just going to, I will read you this little poem because it's of course it's not written in English, it's written in Arabic. But Khalil Gibran, the Lebanese poet, says this, and I agree with him. He says, "Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's song itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you." Right? Remember I said they don't belong to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you. And so when I found this poem, you can imagine how excited I was, because he was saying really, he had the same theory about how we should relate to our children, I think, as we do. And I'm finished.
Thank you, Alan. I think we do have time to take a few questions, if there are, or comments. Welcome, of course.
Do you have some empirical studies on, I don't know, because I'm not on this field, so maybe I'm saying something that is obvious to you, but I'm interested in the difference between, let's say, society advancement of children that are raised by same-sex parents and different sex parents. Do you have, so let's say we have a case-control study that says that if you are raised by same-sex parents or not, you are the same, let's say, in 20 years.
Good, really good question. Really good question. So my reading of such evidence as there is, so same-sex parenting is relatively recent.
Yeah.
So there's a problem in, how long the study could go. And, maybe it's only when they're in their 50s that these children will realise their lives. Things can look good, and of course it depends what you measure. So most of these studies, they simply measure, educational and financial success, occupational success. And of course, if there are problems with same-sex parenting, they may not show up in these data at all, because the problems may be emotional problems, they may be relationship problems, right? So I don't make any strong claims, but all the evidence that there is of all the studies that there are suggests that children of same-sex parents do not suffer for being children of same-sex parents. But of course, there's a big selection effect, right? Because only people who really want to be parents tend to become parents in same-sex relationships. Whereas all kinds of people who don't want to be parents are parents, right? So exactly the studies that would really control for the right variables, I don't think they're available. But it's a crucial issue. And if I have one doubt about my theory, it's that, I don't think we know enough about emotion, about that little bit. I think we just don't know enough about emotional development to know how important it is. I think we know that children need role models of both sexes, right? So I know a lot of same-sex parents, women, and they all take great effort to have men in their lives for the sake of the children. And that's different from having a father. So.
Other questions? I've got another question. And I find this theory of a familiar relationship is really interesting. And I was wondering how much do you consider this as natural or cultural? It's a kind of silly question because you already stated that you don't believe in genetics. But my personal concern is this theory coming from an observation of the society more, or by a kind of philosophical thought, or a combination of the two? And I don't know if you got my point. I mean, because you started with the example of bedtime stories. Okay, so this is, well, because I observed that with producing these relationship goods, this is good for both, for parents and child and children. This is good. So this is observational in some way. But a lot of your thinking is in some way more theoretical. So is it a development of the society that is requiring this approach, or in some way going back to some natural relationship between children and parents?
Yeah, is this one working? Yeah. Yeah, so that's also a really good question. So I think our claim needs to be kind of more universal than, you know, in this particular society, it's good that children get bedtime stories. We need to be making a claim. So we need to be claiming that in societies or cultures where, and I think there are some societies where children are not raised in these kind of informal, loving relationships, and there are certainly parts of societies where they're not, then you know, they're getting something wrong. They're missing out something that's actually really important for human beings. So I think there is a kind of naturalistic claim about what we know about human beings as such, and what, at a very kind of fundamental way, they need for their healthy development. So it's definitely not simply observing that children kind of do better with bedtime stories than those who don't get them. It's some kind of deeper claim, and a more universal claim about the kind of developmental needs of human beings. And more controversially, a kind of a controversial claim about the value of adults, the value for adults of parenting. Because most men, through history, have not had these relationships with children. Right? They haven't been related to children in this kind of a way. They've been out working, they've been earning the money or making the food to feed the children. They've been supporting the children, but not by having this kind of relationship with them. And our claim is that they have missed out on something. Right? And that's why this is a theory for, you know, I don't know if you have in Italian, you know, we have the concept of the new man. Right? This is a kind of a gender-free theory of the value of parenting, you know, for men and for women.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, okay. I'd like to know if you have a sort of opinion about the relationship between the role of the children in the family and what could be for a welfare system for a country. For instance, for the Italian system that is sort of familistic, like you can say the transfer of money from the state to the family, that actually is a sort of we give the money to the father or the mother of the children, so we don't know how they spend for the children. And I'd like your opinion about that. Is it related to a different welfare related to the children?
Yeah. So that's a good question, and the answer is I really don't know. So one way in which I would, if this theory kind of gets attention as a way of thinking about what's good about families, then what I hope is that people who work on policy, social policy, will start to think about kind of welfare policy, welfare regimes in kind of ways that at least kind of pay some attention to these values in the mix. So, you know, an immediate implication is that, you know, state support for family life is a justified goal, right? Now, what that exactly means for, you know, how the welfare system should be organised, you don't do policy, and I don't do social policy, right? So I just don't know. But where there is a normative implication that a legitimate role for the state is to enable family life to go better, and whatever policies will do that. I mean, so we do. You know, I have given other talks which try and bring out some policy implications, and the major policy implication is, do whatever you can to eliminate child poverty. Right? It's like, but that's such an obvious conclusion. You know, there's all kinds of reasons to eliminate child poverty, but here's one. You know, familial relationships are badly distorted in very poor families where parents don't have time to be with their children.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Alan, for sharing your research and your work with us. And it has been really a pleasure to have you here at the Catholic School.
Thank you all.